Miigwech David and Emmerance. I'm really delighted to introduce at this time our keynote speaker tonight. I actually know her mother really well. She's a dear friend, she's a great actress, she's a wonderful mentor of mine and a true inspiration. And it sounds like her daughter is chip off the old block. This year's keynote address is Murielle Borst-Tarrant. She's from Kuna Rappahannock Nations. She's an author, playwright, director, producer, cultural artist, educator, and human rights activist. She is a BFA in Fine Arts from Long Island U. She comes from a long line of cultural activism with her family's theater company, the world-famous Spider Women Theater. Her non-fictional work is published by Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, on the Spider Women Theater methodology. She works on the deconstructing of methods of the arts in Native communities in urban areas across the country, Canada and in New York City, with the education system there. She also consults many urban and non-urban universities on the development on Native theater programming. Nominated for the Rockefeller Grant in 2001, she won a Native Heart Award and was the only Native American woman to have her work be selected by the Olympic Games in Sydney, Australia, at the Sydney Opera House for her one-woman show, More Than Feathers and Beads. For 4 years, she served as the special assistant and liaison to Tanya Ganella Frischner, the North American regional representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. Murielle, as a director, has directed Murielle Miguel in her one-woman show, Red Mother, which IPI has presented at Trent University in OGM Space. It was also performed at La Mama and across Canada. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of EastCoastNative.com, which is an electronic magazine that addresses the artistic, political, social, and economic Indigenous issues in urban areas on the East Coast, including Canada. Murielle's new novel, The Star Medicine, is the first installment in the Star Song Carrier series. And that novel, you can purchase it in electronic format through Apple's bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Sony e-reader. Ladies and gentlemen, and little Gracie, may we introduce Murielle Borst-Tarrant.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. You know, when I hear that, I can't even believe I must be insane to do all of those things at one time. Before I start, I would just really like to thank the territories that I'm standing on right now and the ancestral lands that are here. And I would like to thank them for welcoming me. And I would also like to thank the elders here in this room. And as I was brought up to say, forgive me for being the last one to speak after you. And it was very hard after that one, what Edna said, and it inspired me to even rewrite this whole speech as I was sitting there, and to make me remember what my instructions were from the ancestors. I would also like to thank the whole committee, the volunteers, and I would like to thank Paula for getting me here and helping me, and I would like to acknowledge my stepmother, Deborah Rattel, who's here, has been with my mother for over 30 years, and yes, I have 2 mommies. So, and she went out of her way for us to get here. As it was said, that my name is Murielle Borst-Tarrant. My Indian name is Walking in the Stars. I come from Turtle Clan, and I'm Kuna Rappahannock. And I don't know if you know where the Rappahannocks are from. They're from Virginia. And the Kunas are from off the coast of Panama. And we're a sovereign nation of Kunayala. When I was first asked to be here to speak on this particular subject, I really had to think, you know, what does embodying one's work mean, you know? And I never thought of it in those terminologies, really. I've always said, oh, well, you know, I do political work, and I do theater, and I write. I never think of it, it's coming from my body, and it's coming from my center. But then I really think, you know, what are those instructions that were given, as Edna so eloquently put? You know, what are those instructions and the legacy that I inherited? And the legacy that we've all inherited, really, when you're in the arts, or whether it's beadwork, or whether it's rap, or poetry slamming. You know, what are those instructions that we're embodying and we're giving out into the world? And what does that mean to me when I go out and I represent my family, my clan, and my community? You know, I chose the world of theater in the very beginning to do this type of work, to talk about how we exist. And then I took it into literary writing. And then later on, I took it to work in the international fora at the United Nations. And that always springs a big thing. They say, well, how do you go from that and go into diplomacy? And to me, you know, cultural identity, and that's where I really work from, cannot be compartmentalized. You know, it can't be separated. It's a way of life. It's vibrantly collective. And it's truth. And it's the mirror of our community. And I always felt, as a storyteller, because I felt that storytelling was sacred, as sacred as our songs and our dances and our prayers. Because out of all of those sacred duties that we have done in a community, being our rememberers, we're probably right next to with our political leaders. And I felt that very important. And I was taught by my family that theater is a sacred place. Theater is a sacred right. Art is a sacred right. Because I was taught that storytelling is is storytelling on an epic scale. And that's where I always have taken it. I've always taken it to that, you know, the historical place that is, storytelling has given us our social, legal, and our cultural protocols of indigenous societies that have been passed down to the next generation using the oral tradition, whether it has been respected in mainstream society or not. And as everyone knows that my first training, talking about embodying of women, you know, my first training really is with Spider-Woman Theater. And I grew up in the world of theater. And my first three mentors, other than my grandmother who taught me storytelling, but other than my grandmother, the three most important women in my life is Spider-Woman. And I get, you know, our elders won't always be here, and I get cracked, you know, I always choke up because I always feel, what are we gonna do when they're not here anymore? And when I heard Edna sing, it reminded me of that. It reminded me of a work that I had to continue, and I have to continue no matter what. And so when I think about Spider-Woman, and I think about the weapons they gave me to go into a very European world, you know, to tell people that I matter, that my voice matters. And I was taught very traditionally, actually, because in theater I was taught to shadow, I was taught to sit, I was taught to listen and to observe. And if you think about that, that's a very traditional way of our teachings. And that is how I learned theater, from theater games, from shadowing my mother and becoming a director. And I also think, so then when I took the other hat and I went into the political world, and when I went into diplomacy, which is, I don't think it was no accident that my mentors were the women of the Haudenosaunee Nation. And my main mentor was Tanya Ganella Fishner, who taught me what diplomacy means. And also the Grand Council of Chiefs, very much Oren Lyons, who took me aside and taught me, you know, what is diplomacy? And when I learned that, I learned it was more than smiling and shaking hands and saying, oh, you know, diplomacy is really a traditional, when you're doing the traditional method of diplomacy, it is an aggressive act of negotiation through protocols. And when I was asked to serve by the Grand Council to work as a liaison and to be the special assistant to the UN, I wasn't too sure how I was going to go from theater. I really wasn't. And I said no several times. I was like, you are crazy. I want nothing to do with the UN. And then after talking to me and being trained in those methods, I finally was given an assignment. What was I going to do with that? And my first assignment, or my first task, was to get my community together, and that was the 10th anniversary of Ingrid Washmawata El Asa. She was a colleague of mine and my sister, and she was a fellow warrior. And she was murdered in Colombia talking about human rights issues and indigenous issues. But at the same time, when I was at the UN, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was coming to surface even more so. And, you know, Ingrid really gave her life for that. So what I did was I collaborated with my theater community, which was at the time part of the Public Theater was one of them, and Spider-Woman Theater, the Silver Cloud Singers, and American Indian Law Alliance, and the Permanent Forum. And we did a night of celebration. And part of that, which opened it up, was for the Declaration to be said in 4 separate indigenous languages. So we could do outreach to the community, the theater community, the New York City community, and the international community. So they would know how important this was, so it would be embodied into the community. And then then the following year, I wanted to take the theme, and that theme was with the cultural program and Silver Cloud Singers, and it was a powwow that we did. And why I thought this was important was I wanted to support the theme of the 9th session, and that was Indigenous Peoples, Development with Cultural Identity, Articles 3 and 32 of the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I wanted to bring the theme to the academic community in New York City, especially NYU, and the traditional powwow community. And I wanted them to come from Washington, D.C., and I wanted it to be done in an urban setting. And I just wanted to do this because I feel that Indigenous artist expression and traditional culture are the fabric to community. And it was part of maintaining cultural identity in the urban and rural settings. And I think that's important to highlight that they're not 2 separate things, that, you know, human rights issues in the terms of rural and urban, you know, it doesn't, so it's not drawn away from the fact that there's a historic, cultural and spiritual connection that Indigenous peoples continue to have with their traditional territories, and how they maintain their methodologies, their cosmologies, and cultural design. Indigenous communities who live on their traditional homelands or are removed from their traditional homelands or are relocated from their traditional homelands, or not born with their traditional homelands, that we still have a cultural identity that is essence to our survival. And to take this theme and really to embody it by showing it in movement, our culture, to this world. And that it's not separated, this is part of everyday life. And I felt that was very important to talk about that, because I am an urban Indian. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I come from New York City, and for us to maintain our identity is a fight every day. Because really, literally, in New York, I don't know what the statistics are like in Toronto, but in New York City, we are so, you know, the joke is, you know, dwarfs get more stuff than us, you know, and they're treated with a lot more respect, too. I mean, you know, I remember being an actress, I would go into an audition, and the first thing they would say, you don't look Indian enough. You know, Indians don't have curly hair. You know, you're not light enough. And I used to say, you know, if a dwarf went in there, they would never in a million years say, well, you know, you're just not short enough. But it's okay to say that to us. And, you know, it's no problem. It's, you know, why not, you know? And so, and part of that, what I wanted to do is talk about, you know, what is traditional knowledge? And how is traditional knowledge passed on? And part of that was when I did research the books, how was I going to do it with respect? I mean, and that's really, really important. How do you extract, really, information from a community, any community, and do it with respect? And the only way to do that was to treat it the way, if I was to go into a community, if I was going to talk about water rights, land rights, mineral rights. I had to really think in terms of what is a cultural extraction from a community. And it had to be done with free, prior informed consent. So when I went into a community, I mean, you don't just knock on the door, and everyone thinks this is really how it's done. A lot of non-Indians do think it's like, hello, you know, can I please have some of your traditional copyrights? You know, it sounds like a law firm, you know. And can I please have, let me suck your intellectual property rights from your head, you know. And if you're snotty about it or upset, they turn around and they say, well, she didn't want to tell me anything. Well, I mean, how many people, you couldn't do this with any other culture. But you think, oh, well, hey, you know, the Indians aren't, you know, doing much. Let me knock on their door and get some information. You know, and then, and one of the things was when you go to elders, and how do you treat stories? Do you treat stories the way you would treat sacred songs? How do you treat sacred dances, sacred articles? You know, there are some stories you can't tell. And an example of this, and you know, not to go off the subject, but I will. We're talking about writing in the paranormal, which I do. And some, you know, and how do you get vampire stories? Because everyone has a vampire story, right? And I said, well, you know, maybe I should really figure if there are any Indian vampire stories. They've got to be Indian vampire stories. So I found stories about shapeshifters and witches, and there was tons. Every Indian in the world was going to talk about that. Bring up a vampire, Indians shut their mouth. They don't want to talk to you about it. They say we don't talk about it. And so I finally get one story. I was up in Alaska, and I started asking about these vampire stories. It just seemed like a place that would have a vampire story. And so I go up there and I ask them about vampires. So they tell me the story. So the question is asked, can I repeat this? And the elder says to me, only when there's snow on the ground. Now, you can't put that in a book then, right? So that was my answer was no, I can't repeat the story. I have to make something totally up that has nothing to do, because I don't know about you, but I don't want Indian vampires showing up at my door. Because I do come from a belief system. And the belief system is you better watch what you do, because this is sacred and you better feed whoever shows up. And if they come in vision, you better, you know, acknowledge that. And then, of course, you know, I'll answer this briefly, like, about why I went into fantasy. And really, it was a reaction. And it's because I do everything with reaction. First of all, after reading all of these paranormal fantasy books, they would always come into Turtle Island, and they would never run across Indigenous forces. And I would say to myself, you know, our vampires and werewolves are going to be pretty upset. I mean, you know, wouldn't they be upset if they just came here and were bossy people, you know, bossing other Indigenous forces around? I mean, don't you think there was an Indian vampire who said, hey, come on. You know, you can't just come here and suck everybody's blood. I mean, you know. So that was really the reaction I had. And I was thinking, you know, are the immortals colonialists too? My God! And in the beginning, it was a very serious historical novel, and that's how you say that, you know, because what I do is never taken seriously. Not only am I an Indian, you know, you're writing fantasy, you're writing a genre, you know, it's up there with romance to some people. So when they say, oh, why did you speak, you know, the genre? That's how they talk in New York. And they really don't, you know, when your stuff is better than that, real. And they don't want to call it literature. So I really came to the conclusion I just wanted a story where I could do what I want with beings and immortals that came from my background and creation stories, and how could I do that, you know. And I wanted, there were many different layers that it came into, you know. I wanted almost a Native American godfather. And then finally at one point, you know, there was a big murder in the book. And we have a house in Brooklyn on 333 DeGraw Street, and they bury and it was they bury the body, and it's in the book, right? They bury the body in the backyard. And I said, you know what, I can't, I have to really change this because I don't want people to think that my family has a dead body in the backyard. So once I did that and I changed it, you know, but I needed something that was also going to be political because I knew this was going to be perceived as political because I'm Native and everything I do is political. It doesn't matter what I do, you know. I could work for the Gap as their spokesperson, and it would be called, I could be Snooky. And it would be considered political, you know. And that's what I'm waiting for, the next Native American reality show. But no one wants to do it with me. I think I should call it Life with Murielle. And you can see it, you know, you have the Pulp Fiction music as they introduce everybody in my family, you know. My aunt, you know, the mentor, you know, my mother, the crazy lady, you know, and everybody follow us around for a year. And I think that would be really good. I think that, you know, we would change, but no one's, you know, no one wants to do it with me, so it'd probably only be me with the camera so far. You know, and I also want to talk about the different, what does it mean to be an urban Indian? And that was really a big part of the novel because, again, we are so erased. When they talk about the urban experience on Channel 13, not once do they talk about what it meant when people were coming, different tribes were coming to New York City, and that my family was part of them. And that's how I first started getting these stories. You know, I wanted to talk about the iron workers that were coming in from the reservations upstate New York, the people from Nebraska who were coming from the Wild West shows, and the people were coming in for seamstress, because in 1900, where I set the novel, it was a time when there were a lot of Native people came in, and it was after relocation and after boarding schools. And the families who are there are still there, because, and this is how we survived. So that was the one thing I wanted to do. And then after I puzzled it all together, you know, I had the creation stories that I needed to put in. And I knew the story was epic, and I knew I couldn't do it in one book. And I had these extremely flawed characters, and that's the other thing people ask me, is why is everybody why are your Indian characters so ruthless, and so ambitious, and so flawed? I said, it's a novel about Indians, what do you think it's going to be about? And so when I made an intergalactic tribal meeting, you know, I knew I was at a tribal meeting. I said, wouldn't this be great if everybody was immortal, you know, like Zeus and them? And they decided to have a tribal meeting about whose ancestor was going to get something, you know. And it goes on for 3 days and hours, you know. So that's where I really wanted to go, you know. And that's what I wanted to talk about. And that's how I found the story. And it was a story that was about the human experience, really, even though it's fantasy. You know, it was about love, passion, family, struggle, ruthlessness, you know, betrayal, loyalty, honor, magic, politics, and the sacrifices made for survival. But people don't really understand a lot of the times especially for paranormal to work, the formula, you know, it has to work. It has to have this kind, to work properly, there has to be rules. And a lot of those rules I found in creation stories, you know. They had to be firm and unyielding in belief systems that come from many years of preservation. And that kind of made me crazy because when I was collecting stories, I went from 5 years to 10 years to 25 years. Then I went to 50 years, 100, 500. When I got to 500, I knew I had to go 1 million. And when you say that to people, you know, what do you mean you went back 1 million years? Well, what makes you think that our culture hasn't sustained millions of years on this continent before anybody were even a spark? And that's where you find that you get into this so-called gray area. You know, to a lot of others, it's fantasy. But to us, it's reality because we believe in our clanship. We believe in our systems. We believe these creation stories is where we come from. So that's why it had to be treated in a certain way, or I would just be repeating what everyone else has did in the past, and I had to take responsibility for it. You know, the other thing is that I did Virginia, and Virginia, you know, everyone thinks all Indians, but you know, they all come from, in the United States, out west means Sioux territory. And when I tell them I'm a Rappahannock, I mean, they don't even know what that is. The closest thing I can say is she's related to Pocahontas, which is true. It's the same tribe. People get that, you know. So I wanted to also take Southern Baptist myths, you know, old type of Southern Christian myths that is instilled with Southern Baptist Indians. You know, and it's very Indian too, you know, I have an itch on one side of my nose means a man's coming, itch on the right side of my nose means a woman's coming, then my whole nose started to itch, means money's coming, but then I might have just had a bug bite. And so I had to really think about taking those stories and those expressions, you know, and then really taking it and weaving it in to the mistreatment of Indians in that area. And what did Indians do when they were surviving the Jim Crow laws? So one thing I couldn't find when I was the protagonist. And who I came across was the pursuit of eradication of Native peoples of Virginia of that time. Now this is 1900, this is 1925. And it was a single person, it was Walter Plecker. He was the head of the vital statistics who wanted just two colors in Virginia, white and black. And what he did is he said that Indians were a Mongol race so he can get their land, basically. And he succeeded with a lot of that. And he was, what people don't know, he was a supporter of Adolf Hitler. He was a supporter of the eugenics drive in the country before World War II. And he helped pass the Racial Integrity Act, making whites and non-white illegal to marry in Virginia, and that included Indians. He wanted Virginia Indians eradicated by threatening to imprisoning midwives, not letting them put Indian on the child's birth certificates. Laws, believe it or not, that are still pertaining today, where my tribe is having a very hard time trying to get their land rights, their recognition, and they have to fight for cultural rights because on record it's down that they're colored, that they're not Indian. And so they had no rights at the time. And so through there, I found the protagonist of the story and to write this struggle. But I was doing this for the whole time. You know, it's 6 books. I only have 1 out. I wrote all 6 because I'm a lunatic. And at the same time, I was working with the UN. And I wasn't sure, you know, I wasn't sure how these were all connected, you know, and there were a lot of times I said to myself, I don't know how I'm doing this type of diplomatic work when I have these books and then I'm doing theater. I don't understand how they're connected. Well, during that time, there was a preliminary study on the impact of indigenous peoples. And it's the legal construct known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was delivered by Tanya Ganella Frischner. This is a very long document, you could look it up. But basically, what it was saying, it has institutionalized in law and policy on national, international levels. It lies on the root of the violation of indigenous peoples' human rights, both individual and collective. And this, you see this plainly clear when it became outlawed for indigenous peoples to practice and their own spirituality, their songs, their dances, and it became outlawed. And you see it again when names and images on sports mascots and cultural products or ventures and production enterprises and stereotypes are often derogatory and offensive and disrespectful. And you see it, you know, because it denies what we are. It denies our complexities, our methodologies, our cosmologies. It dehumanizes, and it cannot be separated from our identity, And I had to really think about that because at the same time, the following year, and so basically, therefore, it supports the principle that those who are not Christian are not human. So, to make that simple, and you could have a whole conference on something like this, you know, itself. But that one principle was going on the same time there was a musical going on in New York City called Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. Now, there was 2 distinct things that were happening. There was the doctrine, there was the musical Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, and there was a Native American initiative. Native American Initiative was with the Public Theater, and it was for Native people to have a place where they can have their work. Well, what happened out of that initiative, well, they say it wasn't part of it, but part of that, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson came about. And it was a musical about, I don't know how many people know who Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson is. He was known as the Indian killer. So they made a really fun musical about this, about genocide and everything. But you know, I say to myself, it was a musical, you know, West Side Story is a downer if you think about it. You know, the producer's about Hitler. So why not, you know? So I don't go, and then I get to the forum, and there's elders, and they're crying, and they're upset because the Public Theater and the initiative thought it was really nice that they invited elders to this play. So they come, and they're crying to me, and they're upset. You have to say something, you have to do something. So I said, well, I really can't do anything. I have to see it. So I get my mother, and I get 4 other Indians to go with me. And we go to this play. And in the beginning, I'm trying to be so fair. I really am. I'm being so fair. The music stops. It's on. You know, I love musicals. You know, I'm thinking, oh, you know, maybe they hit the mark. Then the first Indian joke came. Then the second Indian joke came. Then Indians dressed, and then non-Indians dressed as Indians came. Then the big song came. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians done in operetta. I mean, you know, and it really brought me back to all of the memories, being the only Indian in school, being 5 years old, being called a dirty Indian, you know, fighting for your life on the streets in Brooklyn because I lived in an all-Italian neighborhood. And I really remembered what it felt to be dehumanized. And I really started to get afraid at one point because you saw the audience really laughing and going along with this ride. And I felt there was danger to this. There was real clear danger, and it really made me also think what it meant to be Jewish before World War II. Because we all know to dehumanize a race, you have to use the strongest weapon you have, which is the media. And if this play was a hit, that meant it was okay. It's okay to take our land. It's okay to take our water rights. It's okay to have violence against women. It's okay to rape us. It's okay to beat us up. And that's what I got from that play, you know? And it's very interesting because it's almost, well, first of all, let me go make a long story short. A fight breaks out, of course, with all of these Indians, and my mother was a spearheaded. And she went to punch the guy out. Deborah is next to her, had to hold her punching arm. I was 4 things back. I had to get over here, we had to hold her. The guy called my mother stupid and old, and she was gonna punch him out. Oh, and she had no sense of humor. Those things you don't say to a Miguel. They escorted us over, then I decided I had a quorum, and I, you know, Deborah says, no, they weren't listening to you, they were trapped there with you. And I gave them a big speech about human rights, and we're not the crazy people here. You know, we got escorted all the way out, security came. We're outside, professors are yelling and screaming. And then people in the audience said to my mother, who is of Spider-Woman Theater, to say, you know, this is satire. Don't you understand what satire means? So at one point, you know, it turned into, let's kill the actors. I mean, really, they want to kill the actors. And the thing is, you know, I'm an actor, you know, you can't kill the actors. We all just want a job, you know. And you've been in some bad plays if you're an actor. So they're all huddled together and they're afraid to leave because they're afraid the Indians are going to kill them. And the main guy is Meryl Streep's, goes with Meryl Streep's daughter. And he's very talented. I mean, you can't take it away from him. So I go up to each and every one of them and I shake their hand because they're afraid to leave and the Indians are waiting for them outside. And my one friend's yelling, there's no responsibility here. You're no better than the Nazis. You're no better at what happened in Vietnam, in Uganda. I mean, like, you know, these actors never ran across anything like that. They just want their equity cards, for Christ's sakes. So I go up and I shake all their hands and I say, oh, you're very talented people. But I hope this play closes. And it was offensive. And I shook the main guy's hand. I said, I think you're a very talented actor. And I think you have a long, great career ahead of you. But I really want this show to end. So we're all outside, and so he comes out, and his tears in his eyes, and he shakes my hand, and he says, thank you. And he hails a cab, and he says, taxi, and he runs past the Indians, and he goes and sails in some night. We never see him again. So there's huge meetings about this. And what really cracked me up is the theater world, who enjoyed this so much, you know, they use this, we don't know. I mean, you know, it's a play. Who knew genocide would be so upsetting, you know? We thought it was funny. We don't know. You know, they're like the tobacco industry. We roll up these cigarettes, you get cancer. We don't know. And it's the same thing, you know, it's like, we didn't know there was so many Indians. You didn't know there was so many Indians in New York City. And that's an excuse, right? We didn't know, there were so many Indians here. I mean, it brings me to the Martian theory. I mean, look, and I always say this, if I wrote a play about Martians, and they had a Martian musical, and it was a hit, and Martians came in a saucer, whatever they come in, and they come in with little things, and they look at me and they say, we're really upset you wrote this terrible play about Martians. I would say, Martians really exist? How do I know? And I think that's kind of what happens, you know, they treat us the same way, like we're Martians who came from somewhere. And we say, you know, this is a violation of our rights. How can you do that? And they say, we didn't know there were so many still alive. So it's okay to write about you. And so I decided, there were many things I could have done. You know, I could have went to the main media, and I didn't want to make it into a hit, because that's how it works now, right? Went on Facebook, TMZ. I could have stood naked in front of the public theater. I could have split, you know, I had all these protests, but the only thing I could do was create a piece. And the piece I wrote was, oops, bloody, bloody oops. And I turned it into, you know, a musical theater, and I had my mother directed, and then what I want to do is, I made the cabaret. I made a cabaret of genocide, and we all were Germans, and we decided to do this thing called the wigwam wiggle to the bunny hop. And then we made fun of ourselves, but at the same time, we started making fun of everybody else in the audience. And they didn't like that. There was a lot of questions, you know, how can you be so derogatory? But it was okay when 10 Little Indians was being done. Why is that? And that was the question I brought back. And that was when I really felt that theater and politics were coming together. For me, you know, right now I feel Native theater, Indigenous theater, we're at the aesthetic. We're at the aesthetic where this needs to go. That we are not a square. That we don't think in the linear. And we don't have to. And if you want to, then fine. But don't put us all into that same category. You know, it's like the doctrine of discovery, treating us all the same. Because after all, we have no rights, but we do have these cultural rights. We do have these instructions. We do have this legacy that we take on from ancestors. So how do we do that in theater? And what I did is, it's now called a workshop piece, because I don't want to get sued. It's now called a workshop piece, Dante's Inferno, I have to write, A Native Journey into Hell, the life of Native American in show business. And I just wanted to start this conversation. And the conversation was bringing contemporary identity and arts and politics together. You know, we all know that cultural expression is the heart and soul of our community. So let's use that. And that's what we did, Spider-Woman did, by taking that and bringing it to the community, because the community was outraged. You know, but no one knew what to do. It was a frustrated place to be. And that's when I really knew my work wasn't over, you know, and I knew why I was working on an international level, why I was working with the doctrine of discovery, why I decided to go into diplomacy. And just because I did those things does not mean I'm not an artist, I'm not a theater woman, you know, and I'm not a writer. And what do we do because we are so painfully marginalized? And how do we take that aesthetic and we embrace it? We embrace the stereotypes, you know. How do we bridge these gaps? How do we make the colonizer's gaze look in the other direction, away from us who has embodied, you know, has embodied being the freak show? the reality that we are still thought of in that same lens today, if you think about it. How do we get away from being the sideshow, the human zoos, the circuses, the museums? You know, to craft these two different but similar worlds that's happening now and make a contemporary piece. Because that's where we are from. You know, it's a different, this perspective, our perspective isn't seen in the mainstream. And how do we change that, you know? How do we talk in the native voice? You know, how absurd is it that we are always the butt of the joke? You know, and how do we take the doctrine of discovery in language and use it for our benefit in the arts and to fight racism? You know, how do we work through the native lens? And I think that's where we're at right now, because there's so many different perspectives that we come from, because we're collective, yes, but we're so individualized. And that's part of our upbringing, right? To be an individual, even though we're part of the community, especially in theater or the arts, because it's so broad on where you want to go. You know, I was recently asked, how do we write outside of our cultural identity? And a lot of Native writers are asked that. And, you know, I can only say that I write from my point of view, which is being a Native woman. I never said that Natives couldn't write about African Americans or Asian Americans or even other men. I'm saying that when we are writing these things, that I go in with my point of view. And if I'm going to write about an African American community, I'm going to go into that community and I'm going to do some research to find out, is that okay to say that? But therefore, if it's okay for me to go and research and go into your communities, you need to do that with us, and it needs to be done respectfully. And that is what's never done, you know. And when are we ever given the chance to write outside of our point of view or play outside of our point of view? When does that happen? I was going to start a statistic on, you know, on Facebook, they'll say Indians can play other roles. That's why we all can write and we can play other roles, non-Indians say. Okay, fine, I agree with you. That's what acting's about, that's what art's about. But I'm gonna start a countdown. How many Native actors are hired to play outside of Indian? And let's see where that goes. Because I guarantee you the statistic is higher on the other side. And then it's thrown in your face, well, then you're racist and you're no better than Nazis. I mean, I kid you not, that's had been said, because they say you're an exclusive club. And anyone else who said this, they would be called, you say Native rights, you know, someone who says white rights, you know, that's terrible. So how do we avoid it without being called racist? How do we say we have to approach this respectfully? You know, and I think that's where it's the lack of respect. And you see it especially in stereotypes in the media. You know, do we embrace it? I mean, you could be on the phone all the time. Last night I was writing a speech. I'm looking at Third Rock from the Sun. I'm enjoying it. What happens? A fake Native comes on. He's not fake. He's, he's absurd. He has the Village People outfit on. But you laugh at it, right? You have to laugh at it. But think about it, you know, no one goes on anything black-faced. No one does that. And if it was, it'd be an outrage, you know. The same things, you know, people have been bringing up a lot of things about the new movie, you know, Lone Ranger and Tonto. And, you know, I don't put down an actor for the choice that they make. If he says he went to that community, fine. Did he say he was able to do that? Fine. You know, I'm not going to argue with how someone makes a creative choice. I'm not going to say Tonto is not an iconic figure. He is. Jay Silverhills was the first of us who was doing any of this, really, was in there in the industry. But what did they have to swallow to do it? And so it was made from what I saw on Facebook. Facebook's great like this, shows us a picture, but we haven't seen the movie yet. And what bothers me, really, is when we talk about youth, and how is that going to affect our youth? You know, those things, derogatory statements, are going to be okay to say again, just like when Pocahontas came out. That was the one thing I was worried about. Then I had a daughter in school, and she had to do the derogatory jokes were going to come again. That was the one thing I was worried about. So what do? You know, When are we going to say something like that is racism? You know, it reminds me, and when you say something's racism, people run. You know, it's like in the movie Jaws. You know, someone says, you yell barracuda, someone says, oh, what? You say shark, everyone runs. I mean, and that's kind of where we're at right now, because you call somebody on something that's racism, it's there. And how does that affect our youth? How does that dehumanize us? How does that make violence against our Indigenous women? Another example I had, and Facebook's great for this stuff, you know. I was looking at, someone brought me something, America's Top Model, and there was a Native girl on there. And she was told she had to dress in a Pocahontas outfit because she was an iconic figure. Now, not only did she have to wear this cheap outfit with a tomahawk, she wanted to win, so they made her do it. So she gets out on stage, and one of the judges turns around and says, well, you know, you didn't act Indian enough. And then I watched that girl. She's in her 20s. I watched that deterioration in her eyes, because I had been there. And you watched it. And I saw it, and I wanted to call up and say, you don't have to take this, because she feels she has to swallow it. And we have to empower our youth to say they don't have to swallow it. We don't have to take this. This kiss could be a human rights violation, because this is my cultural rights. This is something you're coming on, and you are abusing us through this, saying this is what you have to do. You couldn't do that to an African American. You couldn't do it to a Asian American. You certainly can't do it to a dwarf. But you can do it to us. You know, and then what I find even more ironic is that this show is endorsed by Tyra Banks, an African-American woman. Now, if she was told to wear a slave outfit and to run away from the slave catchers, and then said she didn't act black enough, outrage! The people would come down on that show, but it's okay for us. Why? Really, that's the question. Why? Why is it okay? Because you don't think we exist? Is it education? And I believe there is education. You know, but how is this all tied in with violence against women, which is an epidemic across you know, I come here to Canada, it's violence against women. I come here and in the United States, it's violence against women. And I look at that, and I can only look at the statistic. And if everyone could put their hands up like this, right? Everybody put your hands up like this. It's 10 women. 6 out of 10 women will be abused. And name them off. Your niece, your grandmother, your aunt, your cousin, your mother, and your sister. 6 of those women will be abused or put missing. And if you personalize it like that, think about it. Each and everyone in this room, everyone has a niece, everyone has a sister, everyone has a grandmother, and you personalize that statistic, because we have statistics coming. Statistics are all over. Statistics are on the UN docket. Statistics are on legislation. What does statistics mean if we do not personalize it? And I believe the only way to personalize that is through theater and to embody it. You know, how do we continue this work? How do we keep on going on the positive note? How do we continue the work that was given to us by our aunts, our uncles, our grandmothers, those who prayed for us to come here, to be here? The only answer that I have is that every human being has a right to dignity, to live on this planet. We were all born with dignity, and we have a right, a human right, cultural, political, land rights, it doesn't matter. We have a human right to exist. And we have to believe in those instructions that were given to us as our human rights, as human beings, that our voice matters. We tell the story from the community. We tell the story over and over until it's heard. We paint the portrait. We bead the legging. We sing the song. We narrate the history. We talk about the struggle. We maintain our cultural identity. We embody the colonism and fight against it. We are our human rights, and we take it and we embody it through our toes, our soul, to the air, so the ancestors hear us, and that is what makes Indigenous women's voice so unique and rich. Thank you.